Canada's 2025 budget was released on November 4th, and as most of the banks were predicting, the deficit for 2025 came in much higher than the previous projection at $78.3 billion. At first, I wasn't sure what I was going to focus on in this video, but after digging through this 500-page document for a while, I found something that should probably be the biggest story about the budget, but as far as I can tell, it's been completely ignored by the media and politicians. And hey, if you're one of the people who likes to complain in the comments that I don't criticize the Liberals enough, this is the video for you. You're going to love it. Because I'm going to make a pretty solid argument that everything Carney and the Liberals have been saying about this budget is absolute bullshit. So, let's get right into it. So, just for a little context, Justin Trudeau stepped down as Prime Minister after the 2024 Fall Economic Statement showed that the 2023-24 budget deficit had come out to $61.9 billion, way higher than the $40 billion that had been projected in the initial budget. That sent the Liberals into a leadership election, and Mark Carney, even before being elected, said that the Liberals under Trudeau hadn't been exercising enough fiscal discipline and were spending too much money. He also started making one of his key campaign promises to balance the operating budget within 3 years and focus on a spend less, invest more approach. Balancing the operating budget basically means trying to balance revenue with expenses, but excluding expenses on capital investments like, say, infrastructure projects. Traditionally, we haven't broken the budget up this way, but looking at operating and capital budgets separately isn't actually a terrible idea. Sometimes it can make sense to borrow money to invest in capital assets, but in the long term, you don't want to be borrowing money for day-to-day operating costs. The personal finance equivalent would be, for example, it might make sense to take out a loan to buy something like a house or a car that you're going to have for a long time, but if you need to borrow money to buy food, you're probably in serious financial trouble. Now, my concern with this was that because this approach was new to the federal government and we didn't have existing definitions for what counts as capital investment, they might use a really broad definition that counts a whole bunch of stuff and act like they were investing more when really they were just recategorizing existing spending as capital investment. A month before the budget came out, the Parliamentary Budget Officer published an article saying pretty much the same thing and gave the new definition that the government was using for capital investment, which basically includes any spending or tax cuts that could lead to more investment in Canada. But until the budget came out, we didn't really know what that was going to look like. Now that it's out and we have the estimates for the deficits going forward, as well as the estimates for capital investment, we see that they are in fact on track to balance the operating budget in 3 years, because in the 2028 budget, capital investments of $59.7 billion will be greater than the projected deficit of $57.9 billion, meaning that all of that deficit spending is associated with capital investments. Now here's the thing, and this is what absolutely nobody is talking about as far as I've seen. I wanted to know how much of our existing spending was considered to be capital investment under this new definition and what the operating budget balance was before the new spend less, invest more plan. If Carney is actually doing what he says he's doing, then looking at the baseline Trudeau-era numbers should show us a big operating deficit that wasn't on track to balance out in the future. So down here on page 232, I found their baseline capital investment spending numbers before any policy changes were made and compared that to the overall budgetary balance projections from the 2024 Fall Economic Statement. And it turns out, according to the definition they're using for capital investment, the operating budget was already balanced before Mark Carney took office. I put together this chart showing the operating budget balance starting in 2024 for the status quo projections from the Fall Economic Statement, and as you can see, it's already in a surplus in 2025 and every year going forward. In other words, in his campaign to become leader, Carney said the Trudeau Liberals lacked fiscal discipline and he would bring the operating budget back into balance in 3 years by spending less and investing more. Then they defined capital investments so loosely that the operating budget was already balanced under this new definition, then added so much new spending that the operating budget won't be balanced until 2028. They're balancing the operating budget by starting with an assumption that the operating budget already is balanced. Classic economist move. This isn't so much fiscal discipline as it is just putting a balanced budget on our vision board and manifesting it. Personally, I'm kind of surprised that the budget has been out for a week now and nobody in the media has picked up on this yet. For that matter, the Conservative Party hasn't picked up on it either, maybe because they aren't actually reading the budget that carefully. I mean, you only know about it because you subscribe to an unpopular YouTube channel that started out as a TikTok comedy series. But this kind of flies in the face of everything the government is currently saying about this budgeting approach. Now, you might be saying, well, what about tariffs? Things have changed a lot since the Fall Economic Statement came out in December, and that probably had an impact on the budget. Which is a fair point. So we can look at something called the economic and fiscal developments, which basically looks at how the situation has changed before any government policy actions are accounted for. In other words, this is adjusting for things that are out of the government's direct control, like US tariffs. That's available here on page 66 of the budget, where you can see that these changes did in fact add billions of dollars per year to the deficit. So if we do the same baseline operating budget calculation for the updated numbers, we see a slight operating deficit in 2025, followed by operating surpluses for every year after that. In contrast, here's what the operating budget balance looks like after the new budget. 3 years of deficits followed by eventual surpluses starting in 2028. Despite all the branding around spending less, investing more, and balancing the operating budget, this budget is actually a deterioration in the operating budget, not an improvement. The idea that this is a generational investment also kind of falls flat to me. In the introduction on page 7, they say they're investing $280 billion over 5 years. But according to their baseline numbers, $240.7 billion of that is existing capital spending that was already in the previous budget. The total increase in capital investment over that 5-year period is $38.6 billion. But the overall increase in the deficit from policy actions is $125.7 billion. In other words, about 70% of the increase in the deficit is from straight-up spending, not investments. There's also valid criticisms to be made about where that investment is going. The number one concern among younger Canadians right now is the cost of living, and the largest part of the cost of living is housing. Over the next 5 years combined, additional investment in housing comes to $6.5 billion, or about 5% of the additional deficit spending. Despite all the talk about housing over the past year, this is really not a housing-forward budget. All in all, the stuff that falls under capital investments is around $10 billion a year for the next 4 years starting in 2026, which to me is suspiciously similar to what the Liberals promised in 2015. $10 billion a year in deficit spending on new infrastructure for 4 years. What we ended up getting was much larger deficits and very little in terms of new infrastructure. So to me, this budget is a complete failure on the idea of spending less and investing more, making a generational investment into Canadians, or taking action on housing. We're investing a bit more, spending a lot more, and getting ourselves deeper into debt, as we usually do. As far as I'm concerned, Carney has basically delivered the opposite of all the stuff he said he was going to do during the campaign, but considering that the media is unlikely to pick up on these details, he might just get away with it. Now, that's the big story that I think should be dominating every political headline about the budget, but if you've watched this far, let's get into some of the other issues around the budget. One thing I think is worth looking at, which I've mentioned in videos before, is contingent liabilities. Contingent liabilities are expenses that are expected to have to be paid out in the future but haven't actually been paid yet, such as expected settlements from lawsuits. This was mentioned on page 236 as the primary reason for increased program expenses for the next 5 years. This is kind of a problem because if we're looking at constantly increasing liabilities every year, it's going to be hard to get the deficit under control no matter who's in charge. But as more of a high-level issue, I think it's worth looking at how valid all of these budget projections are in the first place. Over time, we see trends in the budget, like the deficit steadily increasing every year. We also have projections for the budget, which consistently show the budget returning towards balance over the coming years. But there's also trends in projections, the way projections tend to change as we move forward in time. This is going to seem a little complicated, but I'll try to explain it the best I can. This is a chart of all the budget projections over the past 5 years. There's a lot of lines here, but you can see how they're all generally trending upward towards zero, which is where the budget would be balanced. But this is a little messy and hard to understand, so let's look at one line at a time. If we look at the fall economic statement from 2022, we see the deficit slowly decreasing until we hit a $4.5 billion surplus in 2027. However, if we look at the fall economic statement a year later in 2023, we see that the projections get downgraded by about $20 to $30 billion a year. In 2024, they get a little bit lower again, and then another year later at Budget 2025, they're downgraded by tens of billions of dollars again. In other words, as we move forward in time, our projection of the fiscal situation keeps degrading. We can also look at it from the opposite angle. On this chart, every one of these lines is a future year in the budget, and the x-axis is when the projection was made. As you can see, they're all dropping off from close to balanced when they're first predicted into a deep deficit as they get closer to the present. Again, it's a little bit confusing with all these lines on the chart, so let's look at one at a time. This blue line is the projected deficit for the 2025-26 budget year. We were a little bit cautious coming out of the pandemic, but in the fall economic statement for 2022, we hit peak optimism and said the 2025 deficit would only be $14.5 billion. Over the next 3 years, that deteriorated to where we are today, a $78.3 billion deficit. Likewise, we can look at the projected budgetary balance for 2027. In the 2022 fall economic statement, we projected that 2027 would have a surplus of $4.5 billion. However, in just 3 years' time, we're now projecting that 2027 will have a $63.5 billion deficit. If we add the other years back in, they all show the same pattern. As we move forward in time, the projections get worse and worse. So, while you can argue that fully balancing the budget isn't necessary as long as the economy grows faster than the debt, the fact that our projections always turn out to be too optimistic should be a concern. The debt projections here on page 260 show the federal debt to GDP ratio rising over the next 5 or 6 years before stabilizing and starting to decrease again. But is this projection still going to look like this in 5 years? The problem is, these projections can only hold up if you pick a plan and stick to it. But every year or two, to drum up more support, politicians need to make new announcements, and it's pretty much always either new spending or tax cuts, especially close to an election. Realistically, if we want to get the deficit under control at this point, we need to cut spending and raise taxes, and nobody wants to hear that. Regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, constantly increasing public debt isn't good news. I've said previously that I think one of the big underlying factors in a lot of the problems we're seeing today is steadily increasing wealth inequality, which makes it harder for regular people to save money, acquire assets, and get ahead. And government debt is one of the less obvious mechanisms that propagates wealth inequality. Anytime you have a dollar in debt, there's a counterparty somewhere who holds the dollar of credit and charges interest to whoever holds the debt. Canada's federal debt is mostly owned by large institutional investors, both domestically and internationally. Sometimes it's pension funds, but there's also private investors too. So when we hold all this debt, there's a constant stream of money going from Canadian workers to these institutional investors who own tons of assets. For 2025, we're paying $55.6 billion for interest charges, which is about 11% of total government revenues, and by 2029, we're projected to be paying $76.1 billion, or about 13% of all government revenue. And remember, the budget projections keep getting worse every year, so who knows what that'll actually look like 5 years from now. Every $1 billion we spend on interest charges is $1 billion we can't invest in something else. Long story short, you shouldn't be totally unconcerned with public debt. It's very easy to borrow more money, but it gets more and more difficult to pay it back. Now, moving along, what are we actually investing in with this budget? I mentioned earlier that there's a few billion for housing, and a lot of the other investments are about providing financing or funding for public-private partnerships, but not very many have actually been greenlit yet. Here on page 77, they've got a list of specific major projects, but these are just things that have been referred to the Major Projects Office for consideration, not things that have actually been started. Based on what happened with the infrastructure bank 10 years ago, I'll believe it when I see it. On page 101, there's a section on generational infrastructure investments where they say that they want to invest in things like roads, water and wastewater services, hospitals, universities, things like that, which does sound like a good idea. However, if you look at the list of stuff they've approved in this budget, it's almost exclusively recreational facilities. Those are nice to have, but they're not exactly the kind of economy-boosting investments Carney's been talking about. One interesting thing is the productivity super-deduction, which is basically speeding up how quickly new equipment can be written off as a business expense. If you're not familiar with capital cost allowances, basically how business expenses work is that to determine how much profit you've made in a year, you deduct your expenses from your revenue. Anything that's an ongoing or consumable expense can be deducted from revenue right away, but capital assets like equipment have to be expensed gradually over several years. For example, if you had, say, a small farm, you'd have to buy things like seed, fuel, fertilizer, and maybe hire someone to help you, and all those things could be written off as expenses. However, if you bought a piece of equipment, like a tractor, you wouldn't be able to deduct all that right away. It would take place over several years. The new actions in the budget allow faster write-off of those kind of capital investments, including bigger bonuses for stuff like production equipment, computers, clean energy equipment, and research equipment. I think this is actually a pretty good idea. Canada has a big problem with businesses being hesitant to invest in productivity upgrades, so allowing them to expense those things up front will make new investments into productive equipment and assets more appealing, which could help to pull us out of the low productivity, low wage rut we're currently stuck in. They've also got some specific capital cost allowance incentives for the liquefied natural gas industry, but targeted at low carbon LNG facilities. That's determined based on how they rank among other LNG facilities, with the top 25% qualifying for tax incentives and the top 10% qualifying for even bigger incentives. Now, since that's just based on ranking and not on any actual performance benchmarks, I assume we'll see some news stories later on about how facilities are getting low carbon tax subsidies despite emitting a zillion tons of carbon. Still, it's an interesting idea because it incentivizes companies to compete with each other to lower emissions, although I don't know if the incentive is big enough to actually spur new investment into cleaner technology. The other really big item is defense spending, where they've committed $82 billion over the next 5 years in order to meet NATO defense spending commitments. Part of this effort is that they're planning to expand the reserve forces from the current level of 28,000 to 400,000. That breaks down into 100,000 normal reserve members and 300,000 supplementary reserve members, which are normally former military members who are no longer active but willing to return if they're needed. They're apparently planning on sourcing these hundreds of thousands of reservists from members of the public service who could potentially do some training to join the supplementary reserves. I think we'll need to see more details around what the incentives and compensation for that would be, because it's hard to see hundreds of thousands of bureaucrats being interested in doing training and joining the reserve list if there wasn't a good reason to do so. The armed forces are also already reportedly understaffed by about 14,000 people, so finding a few 100,000 more is going to be a tall order. But we'll see how it goes. Something else that was released in the budget was this year's immigration levels plan, which had a couple of notable updates. Most significant was the permanent resident targets, which were set at 385,000 for 2026, then 370,000 in 2027 and 2028. But in addition to that, they added a couple of one-off programs over the next couple of years to fast-track eligible protected persons and some temporary work permit holders into permanent residence. The IRCC did confirm that these programs were in addition to the levels plan targets. You may have seen this alarming headline from Tristan Hopper, who somehow has a recurring column at National Post despite apparently not checking any of his information, in which he says that the budget is granting mass amnesty to asylum seekers. Actually, what the budget says is that they're fast-tracking the PR applications of a certain number of protected persons who are people who have already been vetted by IRCC and are eligible for permanent residence application, not just anybody who wanders over the border and claims asylum. Hopper also says that the number of people to be fast-tracked isn't specified in the budget, but that's because it's in the supplementary information, which is a document that's published along with the immigration levels plan every single year. The supplementary information says that over the next 2 years, they'll be fast-tracking applications for 115,000 protected persons and 33,000 work permit holders. Now, personally, I think that doing this in addition to the levels plan target is pretty misleading, even if they're one-time programs. Technically, all permanent resident submissions are one-time because it's granting permanent immigration status to someone. Just because these people are already in the country doesn't mean that adding 148,000 new PR permits won't have an effect on the population level. However, that's not to say that these people aren't good candidates for permanent residence. We're talking about protected persons who have already been assessed for PR eligibility, and 33,000 temporary workers is only about 2% of the 1.5 million work permit holders in the country. So for temporary workers, this is going to be a pretty selective program, and temporary workers are an extremely broad group that does include a lot of high-skilled workers. However, if we're going to issue more PR permits, it should be accounted for in the levels plan targets. The other big change was that the targets for international student arrivals have been cut in half, from about 300,000 per year to 150,000 per year. I've discussed in a previous video why new arrivals doesn't make sense as a target for temporary residence. It's actually the total permit issuance that matters. But this change is reflecting what we've already seen this year, which is that new arrivals for international students are way down, significantly more so than permit issuance. This is kind of what I was expecting, because to me it indicates that the government is still trying to reduce the temporary population, but are focusing most of their permit issuance on renewals and extensions, not new arrivals. I think this is probably because they're not actually prepared to take hundreds of thousands of enforcement actions if people don't want to leave, so they're basically trying to create pressure relief valves all over the place to unwind the temporary resident bubble. Some people will get into the PR stream, some will renew or extend their permit, and people who are willing to leave on their own will leave. When you lower the amount of new people entering the country, you also lower the number of enforcement actions you might need to take to achieve your population target. If you want some more details on what I'm talking about, you can go watch my video on projecting international migrant populations from public data. Now, there's a bunch of other stuff in the budget and all sorts of political shenanigans going on with MPs crossing the floor resigning, but the budget vote is on November 17th, and I actually want to get this video published before then, so I'll wrap it up here. But as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.